I think in order to fully appreciate the moment between Jesus and his disciples, and namely with Peter there in this morning's scripture reading from the Gospel of Matthew, it's important to place it in a larger historical arc. You see, for hundreds of years, the people of Israel have been occupied by and ruled over by foreign empires and dictators, from the Assyrians in the 7th, 8th century BC, to the Babylonians, to the Persians, to the Greeks, and by the time Jesus is born, the Romans. For hundreds of years, the people of God have waited, longing for God to rend the heavens, as the prophet Isaiah speaks, to rend the heavens, to act decisively like at the Exodus from slavery in Egypt, and overthrow those foreign oppressors and restore the people to self-rule. For hundreds of years, the people of God birthed new generations into a harsh world that continually reminded them of their lowly place in it. And through their groans, they cried out to be saved, to be liberated. Who would be their new Moses? Who would God raise up to carry out this action? The prophet Isaiah spoke what would become this morning's scripture from exile in Babylonia, again, about 600 years before Jesus. Much of the book of Isaiah is written as a response to a traumatic disaster, the invasion of the Babylonian Empire, the world superpower of the ancient Mediterranean world, who on 3 separate occasions marched its large and powerful armies into Jerusalem and its surrounding areas, towns, villages, wreaking havoc and destruction. The holy temple was desecrated, homes were burned, families were separated, many, including livestock, were killed. All those despicable things that always happen in war. Whole communities that remained were carried off in exile to a foreign land, while others were internally displaced. From exile in Babylonia, far from home, Isaiah declares that God is going to act, to bring about this deliverance, that Yahweh is going to use none other than the Persian ruler, King Cyrus. And in fact, the title that God gives to Cyrus in the book of Isaiah, did you catch that? Cyrus is God's Messiah, God's anointed one, which translated to Greek is the Christ. Cyrus is the Christ, through whom God will act to set the people free. Now, this isn't at all who the people expected or who they wanted to act on their behalf. And they do go on to protest in the prophet Isaiah, the book of Isaiah. And it is indeed Cyrus whose armies do eventually defeat Babylonia and allow the people who, like the Israelites, had been displaced as refugees into foreign lands. Cyrus, the Persian king, allows those people to return to their ancestral homelands and begin to rebuild. But unfortunately, that isn't where the story ends. Foreign empires continue to rule over them, to occupy them, and the masses continue to suffer exploitation beneath these rulers. Again, after Persia are the Greeks and the Romans. And the people of God continued to cry out for God to act decisively, to raise up another anointed one, Messiah, to liberate God's people from oppression. Now, the predominant hope amongst the Jewish people by the time that Jesus and his disciples arrive on the scene is that God was indeed about to raise up a Messiah to root out evil, to overthrow Rome, to destroy those evil rulers who used their positions of power to exploit and oppress, to deliver the people to self-rule. Only this time that Messiah would be Jewish. He would be a warrior king, a descendant of the great King David himself. And that is no doubt the hope that also shaped the disciples' expectations, their desire for how God should act, how God would act in their own time and place. Vengeance, violence, victory. Justice and peace through military might. Visions of God's anointed one, visions of God's Messiah were tied to how one viewed God and also to how one should therefore live. And so when Jesus asked the disciples, "But who do you say that I am?" and Peter declares, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God," this is what he seems to have in mind, right? A warrior king who will conquer and overcome through violence. He's just on our side, right? So you can understand then why immediately after Jesus praises Simon for seeing that Jesus has this unique relationship to God, this unique role in the history of the world, and goes on to talk about how as God's anointed one, this path that he is walking will lead to suffering, will lead to his death. Well, you can see why Peter would rebuke him, right? What? Suffer? Die? That's not part of the plan. You're supposed to do that to the bad guys. Clearly you've missed something, Jesus. I imagine in that moment, Peter is also a little bit afraid. Wait, I've put my life on hold to follow you. I've spent so much time away from my family to travel with you, to support your ministry, because this is who I thought you were and what we were going to do together. And you're telling me it was all for nothing? Are you not the Messiah? Are you not the Son of the living God? Are you not who I thought you were? And I'll pause here for just a moment to comment that, like the title of Messiah, Peter calling Jesus the Son of the living God is not actually a moment where he declares Jesus to be divine. I know that might sound like a surprise to some of you, but it's basic knowledge to those of us who have gone through seminary and studied these texts. The Nicene formulation that is laid out hundreds of years later, declaring Jesus to be the only begotten Son of God, to be the pre-existent God the Son, member of the Trinity, is not what Peter has in mind. That notion doesn't yet even exist. In fact, throughout the Old Testament, the phrase Son of God was variously applied to the people of Israel as a whole. They are God's son. It's also used to refer to the king of the people of Israel, like Solomon. Right? It did not mean that one was God, but it did imply this unique and special relationship with God, that this person had a very particular role in leading God's people toward liberation, toward flourishing. Human, but also something unique. But what exactly this something more meant is not really defined. It's just sort of held there. And then beyond the immediate Jewish context, the Roman Emperor Augustus also fancied himself the Son of God. And in fact, emperors after him would continue to claim divine status as a way of tying their program, their view for how the world should operate, with that of God or the gods. And so it was their way that was what God desired for the world. Their vision is what God envisioned. And so again, Peter would have had all of these associations in mind when he declared Jesus to be the Messiah, to be the Son of the living God. Not the emperor, not other rulers, not other unique leaders, but somehow Jesus represented something unique about the way that God desired the world to be and how to get there. And surely God was going to use Jesus to act decisively in history to set the people free. So suffer and die? I have to imagine Peter is kind of like close to hyperventilating in this moment. He is beside himself. What? And I imagine that Jesus, in this exchange, right, Jesus doesn't particularly want to be crucified, that like you or me, he's not a masochist who enjoys suffering, enjoys nails being driven through his wrists, dying slowly by asphyxiation, by suffocation. And I wonder if the intensity of his response, of his rebuke of Peter, has anything to do with this. Is this why he calls Peter a stumbling block? Because he knows where this path will take him, that it will lead to suffering and death, just as he declares it has for other prophets. Just as he prays in the Garden of Gethsemane, there is this part of him that wants this cup to pass from me. But don't tempt me with that, Peter. That is the voice of the evil one, the voice Jesus knows from his own 40 days wandering in the wilderness when he's tempted with all kinds of alternatives to the one that he knew God was calling him to. All kinds of alternatives of power and grandeur and fame and ruling over others. What if he was just a benevolent dictator? Right? Imagine how much he could do. Suffer, die? What is that going to accomplish? You see, when our world unravels, and it does in that moment for Peter, and our beliefs are tested, we often cling to what we know, to what we think we know. And so as Jesus foretells his death and resurrection, Peter protests. He is fixed upon the way that he thinks things should go. He's got a pretty good, clear plan of how God needs to work in the world to bring about the good things. And so he resists the pain of what will come. He's fixed on his own understanding, his own vision, his own way. But Jesus is fixed on his calling. I know what God has called me to do, and I know where it will inevitably lead. Where it has led the prophets before me, or in our own recent historical memory, Dr. King knew toward the end where his call was leading. And so he said, I may not get to the promised land with you, right? People who commit themselves so deeply at some point know the cost. And it's a level of both confidence and humility in one's sense of call that comes from deep discernment and ultimately moving beyond ego desires of grandeur and fame, of being well known and well liked, all the things that we sort of build our lives around. If you are to call me Messiah, Peter, the Son of the living God, clearly we have different understandings of what that means, he says. In contrast to that warrior king who will overthrow evil rulers by force, Jesus will walk to the end, the path that he has already been walking with them, showing them that God's love and justice will not use violence. As understandable as the desire for vengeance, for violence, for retribution may be among those who are suffering beneath the heel, the boot of oppressors and oppression, but rather God's way is altogether different from that vicious cycle of vengeance and violence that keeps staining the soil of our world with blood. As God's anointed one, as one uniquely revealing the way of God to the world, Jesus was showing with his life the way out of violence's vicious and intractable cycles. Violence only, ever, always begets more violence, whether physical or emotional or verbal. You see, Peter has supplied the proper title. He has, in a sense, this proper orientation. of who Jesus is, but he has the wrong understanding. He's not able to put it into action to really give himself to this alternative. Jesus will don the servant's towel rather than the warrior's sword. It turns out that Jesus is not the Messiah, the Son of God, that anyone expected him to be. Or perhaps that any of his followers, Peter most of all, wanted him to be. Which got me thinking this week, what if Jesus isn't who you think he is? Isn't who you were raised to believe he is? What if you, like Peter, have inherited an idea of Jesus, have been so fixed upon a certain image or understanding of Jesus that he is actually trying to break free of, to see someone altogether more, perhaps even in some ways altogether different? And not just for the sake of correcting some belief as if it's better to believe one idea versus another per se, but to call you more fully out of that vision of who Jesus is, who God is, and how God therefore calls us to act in the world, to again respond to conflict as a way out of those vicious cycles of emotional, verbal, physical harm that we do to one another. To a new way of healing wrongs and repairing injustice. What if Jesus, like himself, like with Peter and his disciples, is calling you not just to believe certain ideas, but to give your very life to this way of love and justice in the everydayness of your relationships and of our world, even when it's not popular, even when it comes with a risk or a cost. And so what ideas, what understandings of faith might Jesus be calling you to let go of that are getting in the way of giving yourself to this love and mercy and justice? For everyone, there comes this time when your faith is tested. And again, faith not just as ideas about God, but faith as an orientation for going through the world and what we trust in, what we give ourselves to. For all of us, there comes a time when our faith is tested and we have to face difficult and inconvenient truths. We may want to take that easier path, the path with less pain, like Peter. We may want to cling to easy or simplistic answers, even if we stop believing in them, because to let go of them is also sometimes to begin to lose certain relationships. Or we may think that the only alternative, if we can no longer accept these easy and simplistic answers that we've inherited, been taught, is to have no faith at all. But instead, what might it look like to welcome complexity on this journey? Can you stay fixed upon your convictions while also expanding your perspective? We might even consider, lastly, how this challenge extends beyond Jesus. Is there someone in your life for whom you've been fixated on a certain image or idea about who they are? Is there someone in your life who is trying to break out of the box that you've placed them in? What if they are not who you thought they were? Are not who you've known them to be, but are trying slowly, bit by bit, like any of us, becoming something new? Are you open to allowing them to reveal themselves to you in new ways? Now, none of us can change other people. And maybe they're not, but I think oftentimes we get stuck in these places of just assuming that everybody else is who we've known them to be. And it's worth every once in a while, it's worth